The sterile air of the advanced combat classroom on Xylos Station hummed with the barely audible thrum of atmospheric regulators and the low-frequency resonance of the orbital rotators. It was a sound one learned to ignore, a constant reminder of the thin metallic shell separating them from the indifferent vacuum of deep space. Light, cold and blue, emanated from recessed panels in the ceiling, glinting off the polished chrome steel of the semicircular tiered seating. Holographic displays floated listlessly in the center of the room, currently showing the complex neural pathways of a Cathar warrior during a killing strike, lines of red and gold data scrolling beside the ghostly image. This was a place of science and brutal efficiency, where the art of ending a life was dissected with the precision of a surgical procedure. At the heart of this cold amphitheater stood Instructor Zorgon, a being who seemed to have been carved from the very asteroid the station was built upon. He was an Ursidae, a species renowned for their strength and martial prowess. His massive, fur-covered frame stretched the fabric of his dark gray instructor's uniform to its limits. A web of old scars crisscrossed his broad, ursine face, one pale white line cutting straight through his left eye, which had been replaced with a dull red cybernetic optic that whirred softly when he focused. His voice, when he spoke, was the gravelly sound of rocks grinding together, a sound that commanded absolute and immediate respect. He was a veteran of the Outer Rim skirmishes and the Draconian Purge. It was said he had personally pacified 3 rebellious systems. Today, his lesson was on a subject he knew intimately: the warrior's threshold. It was the moment a soldier transcends training and becomes a killer, the psychological event horizon from which there was no return. A clean execution, Zorgon rumbled, his good eye fixing on the insectoid cadet who had just finished speaking. The target was a pirate drone, its logic matrix slave to a central command. You felt no remorse, Cadet Vrex, because you were not destroying a life. You were decommissioning equipment. Efficient, but it does not test the soul. Cadet Vrex, a Cathar whose chitinous exoskeleton clicked softly as he settled back into his seat, gave a sharp, formal nod. His story, like the ones before it, was clean, predictable. These were the Concordate's finest, chosen from the best military academies across the quadrant. They were trained soldiers, not brutes. Their experiences were logged, sanitized, and ethically justifiable. Zorgon's gaze then shifted to a cadet on the opposite side of the room. Cadet Thalia, your people have a different approach. The Lorian female rose with a motion as fluid and graceful as water. Her skin had a pearlescent sheen under the blue lights, and her large dark eyes blinked slowly. Yes, Instructor. On my homeworld, the first kill is a rite of passage. We hunt the great Koru sea drake. It is a ritual, a dance. We honor its spirit as we take its life, for it is a worthy and venomous adversary. There is no malice, only respect for the cycle of the hunt. She described the hunt with poetic elegance, speaking of currents and tides, of a perfectly thrown hydrosphere, and of the creature's noble, final moments. It was beautiful, spiritual, and 1,000 light-years removed from the grim reality of a battlefield. Zorgon listened with an impassive expression, his massive arms crossed over his chest. He had heard it all before: the clean kills, the ritualistic hunts, the simulated victories. These were the stories of soldiers who had been carefully insulated from the true, ugly face of violence. They were strong, skilled, and disciplined, but he wondered how many of them were truly warriors, deep down in the core of their being. His gaze, both organic and cybernetic, began to sweep across the semicircle of cadets, his scrutiny a palpable force that made several of them shift uncomfortably. He was looking for something more, a flicker of darkness, a hint of the abyss he knew so well. And then his eyes stopped. She sat in the second tier, slightly apart from the others, as if in her own pocket of stillness. Cadet Eva Rostova, the human. Since her unexpected transfer to the War College, She had been a persistent and irritating enigma. Physically, she was unimpressive by galactic standards. She lacked the natural armor of the Cathar, the height of the Ursidae, or the fluid grace of the Lorien. She was a soft-skinned mammal, a bipedal creature from a planet notorious for its chaotic gravity, tectonic instability, and a biosphere that seemed hell-bent on devouring itself. A death world. Her performance metrics were a contradiction. Her scores in strategy, threat assessment, and endurance were off the charts, yet she was quiet, withdrawn, and rarely spoke unless directly addressed. She moved with an unnerving economy of motion, her head always on a subtle swivel, her eyes constantly cataloging her surroundings with a calm, predatory focus that Zorgan recognized, but had never before seen in an untested cadet. He had watched her for weeks, this silent human. He had seen her dismantle combat simulations that had bested his top students. He had seen her in the training cages, her fighting style a brutal, efficient, and utterly graceless form of CQC that seemed to have no name and no rules. She was a puzzle, and Zorgan hated puzzles. He saw her silence not as humility, but as a challenge. "Cadet Rostova," his voice boomed, the gravelly tone cutting through the sterile hum of the room and snapping every cadet to attention. Ava's head lifted, her gray eyes meeting his across the room. There was no surprise in her expression, no flicker of fear or anxiety. She simply waited. "You have been silent," Zorgan continued, taking a slow step forward. "Your file is heavily redacted, a courtesy from High Command that I find inefficient. But it does state your planet of origin, Earth, a known death world, a Class 12 incubator of predatory life." He let the words hang in the air, a deliberate branding for the other cadets to hear. "Surely a creature forged in such a crucible has a tale for us. The Lorians have their ritual hunts, the Cathar have their simulations. Tell the class about your first kill." The question was a direct challenge, a gauntlet thrown down on the cold metallic floor. A low murmur went through the class. The human was being put on the spot. They leaned in, a collective curiosity rippling through them. They expected a story of fending off some rabid canine, or perhaps a desperate encounter during one of her planet's primitive, tribal wars. Ava Rostova's expression did not change. Her gaze remained locked with Zorgan's, unwavering and unnervingly calm. For a long moment, she said nothing, the silence stretching until it became a heavy, uncomfortable weight. Zorgan felt a flicker of triumph, thinking he had finally broken through her composure. But then she blinked, a slow, deliberate motion, and reached down beside her chair, her hand disappearing from view. Her hand returned from beneath the desk, gripping the neck of a sack. It was not standard military issue. It was made of a dark, rugged material that looked like oiled animal hide, cracked and weathered with extreme age. The drawstring was a simple leather thong tied in a thick, utilitarian knot. As she lifted it, the cadets in the front row could see the faint, dark stains that mottled its surface, patterns that spoke of long journeys and heavy contents. The object within was clearly dense, and she placed the bag on her polished chrome desk with a solid, definitive thud that echoed slightly in the tense silence. For a moment, she simply rested her hand on it, her fingers splayed across the worn fabric. Instructor Zorgan watched, his single organic eye narrowed, and the red photoreceptor of his cybernetic implant whirring as it zoomed in, analyzing the object. He had expected a data slate, perhaps, with a recording of some minor skirmish. Or maybe a weapon, a primitive knife from her homeworld she would present as a trophy. This was unexpected. It was theatrical. A flicker of annoyance crossed his scarred face. He had intended to put the human in her place, to expose her silence as a lack of experience. He had not intended to provide her with a stage. Still, he remained silent, crossing his massive arms over his chest in a posture of challenged authority, waiting for her to proceed with her little show. He would let her have her moment before he dismantled whatever story she had concocted. The other cadets were frozen, their collective attention now a palpable force directed at the small, unassuming human and the mysterious bag before her. Vrex, the Cathar, tilted his head, his multifaceted eyes trying to process the strange scene. His mind, accustomed to logic and directness, could find no precedent for this kind of response to an instructor's query. Beside him, the Lorian, Thalia, felt a sudden chill, a subtle wrongness that emanated from the human cadet. It was not malice, but a profound and ancient cold, like the pressure in the deepest, sunless trenches of her homeworld's oceans. She subconsciously drew her glistening robes tighter around herself. Ava's fingers, which were neither trembling nor hesitant, moved to the leather thong. She worked at the knot with a practiced familiarity, her movements economical and precise. It was a knot she had clearly tied and untied 1,000 times before. The quiet rasp of the leather pulling free was unnaturally loud in the silent room. With the drawstring loosened, she did not peer inside or reach in to retrieve the contents. Instead, she took the bottom corners of the bag in her hands, her expression as placid and unreadable as a mask carved from ice. She looked directly at Instructor Zorgan, her gray eyes holding his gaze in a silent, final challenge. Then, with a single, fluid motion, she lifted and tilted the bag. Something heavy and bone-white slid out, its exit from the dark confines of the bag shockingly abrupt. It struck the desk not with a clatter, but with a deep, solid crack, a sound of immense density. It rolled once, a flash of ivory against the dark chrome, before tumbling over the edge. It fell the short distance to the floor of the lecture pit, landing with another loud, echoing crack that made several cadets flinch. The object spun on the polished floor, a macabre top, before slowly wobbling to a halt directly at the feet of Instructor Zorgan's immense, booted feet. It was a skull. A wave of collective shock washed through the classroom, so profound that it was utterly silent. There was no gasp, no cry of surprise. There was only the sudden, sharp intake of 100 different lungs, followed by a stillness so absolute it felt as though the station's life support itself had failed. The floating holographic displays showing neural pathways seemed to flicker and dim, their cold data irrelevant in the face of the primal object now resting on the floor. This was no trophy from a ritual hunt, carefully cleaned and mounted. It was a relic. The bone was yellowed in places, pitted and scarred from age and exposure. A fine lacework of fractures covered its surface, but one side of the cranium was brutally caved in, a gaping, starburst pattern of shattered bone that spoke of a single, momentously violent impact. Most terrifying of all, however, was its morphology. It was clearly alien, belonging to no species registered in the Concordate's vast xenobiological database. The jaw was elongated, filled with rows of serrated, needle-like teeth designed for shearing through flesh and armor. The eye sockets were large and forward-facing, set above a reinforced nasal cavity built for a supreme hunter. It was the skull of an apex predator, a creature born and bred for killing, and it was a skull that told a story of its own death, a brutal, desperate end delivered with savage force. Zorgan stared down, his massive frame frozen in place. The smug annoyance had evaporated from his mind, replaced by a cold, sharp shock that pierced through his decades of combat experience. He had seen the skulls of 1,000 different species on 100 different battlefields. He had never seen anything like this. His cybernetic eye whirred frantically, cross-referencing, analyzing, and finding nothing. His organic eye took in the raw, physical truth of it. He saw the way the jaw was slightly unhinged, the sheer predatory perfection of its design, and the raw, undeniable proof of its violent end. The question he had asked so dismissively moments before now hung in the air, a foolish, ignorant prod at something vast and terrible. He had asked a human death worlder for the story of her first kill, and she had answered by letting the evidence of it roll to a stop at his feet. The silence in the classroom was no longer just an absence of sound. It had become a physical presence, a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed down on every occupant. The air itself seemed to have congealed, thick with the unasked questions and the primal, chilling reality of the object on the floor. Vrex the Cathar remained motionless, his analytical mind struggling to categorize the raw, unclinical data before him. Thalia the Lorian felt a profound sorrow, an empathic echo of a pain so immense it was almost incomprehensible. Every cadet in the room, beings from worlds of order, ritual, and technology, was now staring at an artifact from a reality they could barely imagine. And Instructor Zorgon, the scarred veteran of 100 battles, stood utterly still, his gaze fixed on the shattered cranium as if it were a live grenade. He had demanded a story, and the story's brutal prologue now lay at his feet. It was Eva who finally broke the spell. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, nor was it filled with emotion. It was a low, even monotone, the sound of a person reading a dry, factual report. The stark contrast between her calm delivery and the horrific object on the floor made every word she uttered land with the force of a physical blow. "I was 7 years old," she began, her eyes not on the skull, but fixed on some distant point in the middle of the room, a point no one else could see. "My parents were xenobotanists on a long-range survey vessel, the Stardust Drifter. We were charting unmapped nebulae in the Cygnus Arm. There was a cascade failure in the nav computer during a plasma storm, a miscalculation in the gravity well projections. We were pulled into orbit around an uncharted moon." She paused, taking a slow breath. "The ship broke apart on entry. My parents and I survived the crash. We were the only ones. The moon was designated LV-742 in the ship's emergency logs. The sky was a permanent, bruised twilight. The plants were crystalline, sharp enough to cut skin, and the air tasted of metal. We were alone." Her gaze drifted towards the skull, and for the first time, a flicker of some deep, ancient memory crossed her face. We were not alone for long. On the second cycle, we started to hear it, a sound, at the edge of our hearing, like stone scraping on stone. On the third, we began to see it, a flicker of motion in the petrified forest that surrounded the wreckage. It was hunting us. My father called it a stalker. It was intelligent. It learned our patterns, the times we left the relative safety of the broken fuselage to search for water. It never attacked directly. It tested our defenses, observed, and waited. The psychological toll was immense. We never truly slept. No one in the classroom moved. They were no longer cadets in a sterile lecture hall. They were listening to a ghost story being told by the ghost herself. "On the 10th cycle," Eva continued, her voice dropping even lower, "it came for us. It didn't use stealth anymore. There was a terrible, confident sound as it tore through the twisted metal of the ship. My father had a plasma cutter. It was the only thing we had that resembled a weapon. He stood between it and us." She paused, and her throat worked for a moment before she found her voice again. The creature was fast, unbelievably fast. The plasma beam scored a glancing blow against its shoulder, but its hide was like armored plating. The stalker's claw caught my father across the chest. He was gone before he hit the floor. Her eyes were now locked onto the skull, and she spoke directly to it, her voice a near whisper that every cadet strained to hear. It cornered my mother and me in the small engineering bay. The door was jammed shut. There was nowhere left to run. My mother, she pushed me behind a coolant conduit, told me not to make a sound, no matter what happened. She stood up, armed with nothing but a metal strut she had torn from the wall. She was trying to buy me time, to draw its attention. She screamed at it. Eva's hand, resting on her desk, slowly clenched into a white-knuckled fist. Behind the conduit was a survey kit that had broken open in the crash. It was full of geological tools. I found a hammer. It was designed for splitting rock samples, heavy, with a weighted head and a pointed pick on one side. I could barely lift it with both hands. The stalker was focused on my mother. It saw her as the only remaining threat. It didn't see the child. It didn't register the small, terrified thing hiding in the shadows. It raised its claw for a final strike. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. "I had one chance," Eva whispered. I didn't scream. I didn't think. There was nothing in my head but a white, hot need for it to stop. I ran out from behind the conduit. It started to turn its head towards the sound, its jaw opening. I swung the hammer with all the strength a 7-year-old girl possessed. I put all my weight, all my fear, and all my rage into that one single swing. I aimed for its head. She fell silent. The story was over. The conclusion lay on the floor for all to see. The caved-in cranium, the shattered bone, the silent, screaming testament to a child's last, desperate act of survival. Eva finally looked up from the skull and met Instructor Zorgan's gaze once more. "You asked me about my first kill, Instructor," she said, her voice clear and steady again. That was it. I did not feel remorse. I did not feel respect for the cycle of the hunt. I felt the bones in its head give way under the metal, and then I felt nothing at all for a very long time. The silence that followed her final words was heavier and more absolute than what had come before. Her quiet, factual statement, "I felt nothing at all for a very long time," was a closing sentence not just to a story, but to a part of her own existence. It was a confession of a soul cauterized by trauma, and it hung in the sterile air of the classroom like a cloud of radioactive dust. The story was over. The lesson, however, had just begun, and the teacher was no longer the scarred or seedy at the front of the room. The true instructor was the ghost of a 7-year-old girl, and her lecture was contained within the shattered relic on the floor. Instructor Zorgan stood as if rooted to the spot, his formidable presence diminished. He, who had weathered plasma fire and stared down entire battalions, felt profoundly and uncomfortably humbled. His challenge, his arrogant prodding of the quiet human, now seemed like the foolish act of a child poking a sleeping leviathan. He had demanded she prove her worthiness as a warrior, and she had responded by revealing a truth so fundamental and so horrifying that it made his own decades of sanctioned warfare feel like a sterile simulation. His own first kill had been a pirate scout in the asteroid fields of Keldrani, a flash of light on a view screen, a new icon on a tactical display. It had been distant, clean, and impersonal. He had felt a surge of adrenaline, of victory. He had not felt the crunch of bone beneath his hands or watched the light fade from the eyes of a creature that had just murdered his family. Slowly, as if moving through a dense fluid, Zorgan lowered his massive arms to his sides. His gaze dropped from Eva's unblinking eyes down to the skull at his feet. It was no longer just a piece of bone. It was an icon of survival, a testament to an experience so far beyond the scope of his curriculum that it rendered his entire lesson plan meaningless. With a soft groan of stressed joints, the great Ursidi warrior bent down. His movements were not clumsy, but deliberate, and imbued with a strange, new reverence. His large, claw-tipped fingers, which could tear through plasteel, were surprisingly gentle as they closed around the object. He lifted the skull. He felt its weight, heavier than it should be, as if it were still filled with the gravity of the forgotten moon, where it was born and died. He turned it over in his hands, his cybernetic eye scanning its contours, while his organic eye took in the grim details. He was a master of combat, an expert in weapons and their effects. His thumb traced the jagged edge of the catastrophic wound. He understood force and trajectory, the physics of impact. The blow had come from the side and slightly from below, an upward swing. It was the desperate angle of a much smaller combatant attacking a taller foe. The force required to create such a fracture, to shatter a cranium that was clearly a piece of natural biological armor, was immense. For a child to have delivered it, it was a statistical impossibility, an act born not of strength, but of a will so absolute and so focused that it had momentarily bent the laws of physics to its purpose. He finally looked up from the skull and back at Ava. He truly saw her for the first time. He saw past the quiet cadet and the unassuming human. He saw the faint, silvery trace of a scar near her hairline, almost hidden by her hair. He noticed the way her hands rested on the desk, not relaxed, but coiled, perpetually ready. He understood her silence now. It wasn't weakness or arrogance. It was the vigilance of the hunted. It was the quiet economy of a person who had learned, at the most fundamental level, that wasted energy and unnecessary noise were luxuries that led to death. Across the room, the other cadets were undergoing their own silent recalibrations. Vrex the Cathar had ceased all analysis. His species revered brutal efficiency, and what he had just heard described was the most efficient, most brutal application of survival instinct he had ever encountered. The human was not soft. She was a predator who had killed a greater predator. It was a simple, terrifying equation. Thalia the Lorian felt tears welling in her large, dark eyes, not just for the child Ava had been, but for the woman she had been forced to become. Her beautiful, ritualistic hunt of the sea drake now felt like a hollow, privileged game. She, and all the others, subtly shifted in their seats, their posture creating a fractional, yet significant increase in the distance between themselves and the human cadet. The social fabric of the class had been rewoven in an instant. Eva Rostova was no longer just a classmate. She was an omen. Zorgan straightened to his full height, the skull held carefully in his two hands. He did not return it to her. He did not cast it aside. Instead, he turned and walked the few steps to his own lectern, the elevated platform from which he delivered his lessons on the nature of warfare. With a quiet, deliberate motion, he placed the skull upon it, setting it down in the exact center where his own data slate usually rested. It sat there under the cold, blue lights, a stark and brutal centerpiece that completely overshadowed the holographic displays. It had been an answer to a question, then evidence for a story. Now, it was a monument. He turned back to face the stunned class. His expression was grim, all traces of his earlier arrogance gone, replaced by a deep and somber gravity. His voice, when he finally spoke, was not the booming command of an instructor. It was a strained, rough rasp. Class is dismissed. The hiss of the pneumatic door sliding shut was a final, sealing sound, cutting off the last whispers of the station's corridor and plunging the classroom into a profound and heavy silence. The other cadets had departed with a haste that bordered on flight, a scattered herd spooked by the sudden appearance of a true predator in their midst. None of them had looked at her as they left. Their gazes had skittered away, unable to reconcile the quiet, unassuming classmate they thought they knew with the 7-year-old ghost who had just confessed to a matricide of monsters. Now, only two beings remained in the vast, cold room: the instructor whose authority had been fractured, and the student who had unwillingly revealed the terrible source of her strength. Between them, on the polished surface of the lectern, the skull sat like a silent, third presence, a judge and a jury in one. Zorgan stood motionless for a long time, his great, shaggy head bowed slightly as he contemplated the artifact. The cold blue light of the classroom glinted off the yellowed bone, making it seem almost luminous. He felt the foundations of his own long and bloody career shifting beneath his feet. He had always believed in the crucible of battle, in the shaping force of conflict. He taught that war forged soldiers from raw recruits, but the human girl before him had not been forged in any war he could name. She had been born from a singular, personal apocalypse. War had rules, however brutal. It had objectives, comrades, and a chain of command. What she had endured was something far more primal. Finally, he raised his head and looked at her. She had not moved from her desk, her posture unchanged, her hands resting calmly on the chrome surface. but he saw now the tension in her shoulders, the faint, almost imperceptible tremor in her clenched fist. The placid mask was a thing of immense effort, and it was beginning to show its cracks. He chose his words with a care he had not used in decades. "My lesson today," he began, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that was now devoid of its former arrogance, "was on the warrior's threshold, an academic term for a moment of truth." He took a slow, deliberate step down from the lecture pit, closing the distance between them, his heavy boots making soft, deliberate sounds on the floor. "It is a meaningless term. What you have described, that is no threshold. It is an abyss, and you have been living on its other side ever since." Eva did not respond, but her eyes, which had been fixed on some distant, unseen point, slowly focused on him. He saw in them not defiance or fear, but a deep, oceanic weariness. "I apologize, Cadet," Zorgon said, and the words, coming from the legendary Instructor, were as shocking in their own way as her story had been. "My question was born of ignorance. It was a foolish challenge, and it was unworthy of me." He stopped a few feet from her desk. "How long were you on that moon after the event?" he asked, his tone now that of a fellow veteran seeking to understand a brother-in-arms tour of duty. "I was rescued 3 standard years later by a rogue prospector," Eva answered, her voice still quiet, but now there was a slight rasp of disuse, as if the story had taken a physical toll on her. "I kept the skull. At first, it was to prove to myself that it had really happened. Later, it became a reminder, not of what I had lost, but of what I was capable of. A reminder that no matter how bad things get, they have been worse, and I have survived worse." Zorgon nodded slowly, a deep and resonant understanding passing between the giant Ursidai and the small human. He finally understood the source of her bafflingly high performance scores. A simulation, however advanced, could never replicate the stakes of absolute survival. The fear of failure in the academy meant a poor grade. For her, failure had meant being devoured in a dark cave on a forgotten moon. It was a level of motivation his other cadets could never hope to comprehend. He turned, walked back to the lectern, and once more picked up the skull. He held it not as an instructor holding a teaching aid, but as a soldier holding the weapon of a fallen comrade. He carried it over to her desk and gently placed it down beside her still clenched fist. "This is yours," he said softly. "It is your history, your burden, and your strength. The Concordat will not take it from you." He paused. "Your sealed file. I will be adding an addendum to it myself. It will state that Cadet Rostova's practical combat experience is to be considered a viable substitute for all preliminary psychological conditioning drills. You will be exempt." It was the highest professional courtesy he could offer, an official acknowledgement that she was not a student to be molded, but a weapon to be aimed. For the first time, a genuine emotion flickered across Ava's face. Surprise. Her mask of detached calm broke for just an instant. She had expected punishment, or perhaps a psychiatric discharge. She had not expected to be understood. She looked from the skull to the Instructor, and her hand unclenched. Slowly, with the same deliberate care she had shown before, she picked up her old oilskin bag. She opened the drawstring, and with a motion that was both tender and final, placed the skull back inside. She pulled the leather thong tight, the rasping sound once again seeming to be the only noise in the universe. Her history was once more contained. She stood up, slinging the bag's strap over her shoulder. The weight of it seemed to settle her, to straighten her spine. "Thank you, Instructor," she said. "Zorgon," he corrected her, the use of his name a final offering of respect. "Ava, there is nothing more I can teach you about what it takes to survive. You wrote that textbook. But this is a war college. Survival is not the ultimate goal here. Victory is. You know how to fight for yourself. I can teach you how to fight for others. I can teach you how to be part of a unit, how to lead one, if you will let me." It was a new contract, a new path forward being offered. It was a chance not to forget her past, but to build a future beyond it. A future where she was more than just the last survivor of LV-742. A future where she could be a soldier, a warrior, a protector. A small, almost imperceptible nod was her only answer, but it was enough. It was a beginning. "Yes, Instructor," she said, her voice firm. She turned and walked towards the exit, her steps sure and steady. The door hissed open before her, spilling the brighter light of the corridor into the dim classroom. She did not look back as she stepped through, the door hissing shut behind her, leaving Zorgan alone in the sudden silence. He stood there for a long time, his gaze fixed on the empty spot on his lectern. The lesson was over. A legend had been confirmed, and a new soldier had just truly enlisted.